Hi everybody, welcome along to another episode of The Dispatches. My name is Brendan Malone. It is great to be back with you again. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the fact that sense and sensibility, common sense, has finally returned to terrorist designations here in New Zealand. What am I talking about? Well, official terrorist designations are given out by the New Zealand state to organisations or groups, I guess maybe even individuals, who might be considered a legitimate terroristic threat here in New Zealand. And a troubling incident happened back in 2022. Now, for those who have been with the podcast for that long, you will remember that I did an in-depth episode where I looked at this particular ruling all the way back. I think it was in about July of 2022 that this was announced, that the New Zealand government, and you will remember at the time that this was the Ardern Labour government, they had decided to designate two groups in particular from the United States as terrorist entities, according to the Terrorism Suppression Act here in New Zealand. Now, one of those groups, called the Base, it was pretty clear to me, doing just even a rudimentary and basic level of research about them, they absolutely qualified for what you would call a terrorist organisation, and it was right. Certainly in one sense. I don't know if they operate here in New Zealand, and so that's the secondary question. Should you really designate a group that doesn't have a presence in your own country as a terrorist organisation? However, there might be legitimate reasons why you might do that, as long as the group actually meets the criteria. And that group, the Base, definitely meet the criteria for what you would call a terrorist organisation, a terrorist entity, and so it was appropriate that they were designated as such back in 2022 by the New Zealand government. But the reason I made the podcast episode focusing on this particular development all the way back in 2022 was because at the same time, the New Zealand government also designated another group, the Proud Boys, as a terrorist organisation. And that designation was the one that I had a very serious level of concern about. First of all, the Proud Boys don't operate here in New Zealand. And I think that, again, raises a question. Why would the New Zealand government be labelling entities or groups that don't actually operate, don't have a presence, and there's no indication whatsoever that anyone was even trying to set up a Proud Boys group here in New Zealand. So why would you even label such an organisation as a terrorist entity? And the reason I say that is because you obviously have to spend time and resources, reports and investigations have to be prepared for all of this, and then valuable committee time is spent on this, and it goes through the Prime Minister's office. So there's a lot of time, effort, resources, energy that is invested in doing this and using your national security resources for this reason. And it seems to me that they could be better spent in other places, identifying actual and very serious and real threats that are local and serious threats to us here in New Zealand, and working on those projects rather than, designating a group that doesn't even exist here and there's no indication they even want to set up here as a terrorist entity. So that's problem number one. I mean, obviously the terrorist organisations, the groups who designate you a terrorist organisation, that was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? The New Zealand government I'm talking about here, who have this oversight and who decide our security and intelligence agencies, who have a special committee that gathers together and makes these designations, surely they wouldn't be saying, let's make the Basque separatists or the Chechnyan People's Front, or I don't know if even such a group exists, but, groups like that have a presence overseas, don't have a presence here, don't pose any local threat. Let's not waste our time on those groups. Let's focus on real local threats. This felt a lot more to me like a politicised moment that was really about what was going on in America with Donald Trump. And you saw a bit of this, by the way, in other aspects of completely different issues that were happening, where Western countries were starting to sort of follow along with political decisions that were being made that were really about the politics of American domestic politics, and they were sort of joining in with that from afar. And this felt like one of those trends. And the second, and I think even more important reason why I had concerns about this, because I'm just so we're clear here, I have no affinity with the Proud Boys. I don't have, the reality is, if I was going to be honest, I'd critique some of their behaviours. I think that they do lack virtue, and that the approach they take is not always a good one. But it's pretty clear to me that when you actually look at the group, its origins, what it does, how it exists in the world, I don't think by any legitimate and fair standard is it absolutely at all appropriate to designate them as a terrorist organisation. They are not that. There are other things that you could designate them and call them if you want to. uncouth, lacking in virtue, rude, disruptive, etc. But those things are not the same thing as terrorism. Terrorism has a very specific definition. It's about political aims, and it's about using violence to achieve political aims. And unless you can actually show that that's what the group exists for, it's got a mandate for that purpose, it's engaging in that behaviours, then I don't think you should be designating them a terrorist entity, because that has huge ramifications. What happens if you find other groups, for example, that you dislike? You find their politics disagreeable, you find their public engagement strategies dislikable and even maybe confronting. They're not violent, they are not aiming to overthrow, they don't engage in terrorist behaviours, anything like that at all. Well, what happens in that moment when you are confronted with a group, like, for example, a pro-life group that engages peacefully with people on the streets of New Zealand to oppose the act of abortion? Should they also be designated a terrorist entity? There are some really big ramifications that flow on from this if you don't do this according to an objective and truthful measure. And my concern was it felt like the designation of the Proud Boys, a group that I have no official affinity with, and I actually have a dislike of some of their behaviours and would want to critique. I talked about that in the podcast. The fact that they were designated a terrorist entity here in New Zealand, and on top of the fact they don't have a presence here, there's no indication they're trying to set up here, so there was no good reason to use resources in this way. I have a problem with this because it says a lot about the nature of how our security and intelligence apparatuses are being used, and effectively they've become politicised in that moment. So I did an episode, you'll remember, and after I did that episode, I talked to my listeners about the fact that I had decided to submit an Official Information Act request to try and find out a bit more information about how they had come to this decision. Who had advised them? Who had produced this report? They'd written a report. The report had some glaring deficiencies. I talked about that in the podcast episode back in 2022. And so I submitted an Official Information Act request, and I'll show that to you right now so you can see what I'm talking about. This is the Official Information Act request, and this is the reply that I got. So I submitted my request back in July of 2022, and then almost 3 years ago, I received a reply from the New Zealand Police. And I won't bore you by going through all of the 11 different questions that I asked them to try and sort of find out, well, who wrote this report? Was there outside authors from New Zealand? What basis did you use, et cetera, because basically it would probably bore you to tears. The responses that I got to this Official Information Act request were effectively very typical of what happens in these cases now, where you get the fob off. The officials give you the bare minimum of information. They don't really answer the question. They do everything often they can to avoid answering the question. And so I won't bore you by going through every single one, but there was one final question that I do think was quite important that I asked, and I said this in question number 11. Have the New Zealand Police ever investigated the activities of the group Antifa to determine whether they should also be classified as a terrorist entity within New Zealand pursuant to the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002? And I was asking that for a good reason, and the answer that I got to that was actually quite revealing. And the reason why I say this is twofold. Antifa does have a presence here in New Zealand. If I understand things correctly, Antifa, who claim to be the anti-fascist group, they have a presence in multiple different cities around New Zealand. They definitely have a presence here in New Zealand, an open public presence. And secondly, even more importantly, the group Antifa in America have engaged in what are quite clearly, I think, if not legitimately could be called this, are like as close as you can get to legitimately calling terroristic behaviours. They have absolutely been willing, and they've been shown to be willing to use violence to achieve their political aims. And so this seemed like a very relevant question to ask, because if you're going to designate the Proud Boys, who definitely aren't in the same league as Antifa, in fact, the Proud Boys set themselves up as a reaction to Antifa, if I understand their history correctly. And so I think this was a worthwhile question. Now, the answer I got was fascinating. This was the answer that New Zealand Police gave me. Police has not identified any action by anti-fascist activists that would qualify as a terrorist act under Section 5 of the Terrorism Suppression Act 2002. Now, what's interesting about that is the fact that that's also equally true of the Proud Boys. There's nothing that you could say about the Proud Boys that would meet that definition either. So it seems that this was quite a revealing moment. And it said a lot about the politics of what was actually going on. Like I said, this was actually more about the politics of what was happening in America and the anti-Trump politics and how they basically wanted to react to the anti-Trump politics from afar. And we've seen this in other situations under the Ardern government. This happened a couple of times in other areas, like around the issue of abortion and the abortion pill. There was a court case happening in the States, and they all of a sudden were saying that, it wasn't safe to use to use a abortion pill reversal method, and all of a sudden they were threatening people with, legal sanctions, so serious fines or even imprisonment if you were even recommending abortion pill reversals in New Zealand, which is crazy because the abortion pill reversal, it's a 2-stage pill, the abortion pill for those who don't know, and after stage 1, what you can do if you get there in time is you can actually use progesterone to try and protect the mum and her baby so that the baby is not lost. Progesterone, all you're doing there is you're using progesterone, this pharmaceutical product that's used all over the place in New Zealand for lots of other reasons, as an off-label drug in that situation. And in New Zealand, I went and double-checked the law, and as far as I can understand the law, you can do that legally. You can use an off-label drug, like you can use a drug off-label for a non-prescribed purpose, as long as there is informed consent with the patient involved. So there's no other restriction. But all of a sudden, here with this particular off-label use, they were saying that this was dangerous. Now, why that was even more dubious was the fact that progesterone, first of all, is used when it comes to things like gender transitioning. So if it's not safe, why has it been used there? Secondly, even more pressing, progesterone is the very thing that you would actually use in cases where you want to try and reduce the risk of a miscarriage in a woman who is pregnant and desperately doesn't want to lose her baby. So that's the very mechanism that they are trying to use this pill for, or this pharmaceutical product for, in the case of an abortion pill reversal. So the whole thing was highly dubious. But then when you look at what was going on in America at the time, you realize, there's a sort of a political connection here. So basically you have a politicization, I think, of our terrorist, not our terrorist organizations. Again, this is the government I'm talking about here, but we have this abuse of this process of these government departments for politicization and political purposes, and that's not a good thing. So basically what happens is every 3 years, this particular designation, I don't know if this applies all the time, but in this case it does, every 3 years, this designation of, are you a terrorist entity or not, it comes up for review. And last week, something fascinating happened. The New Zealand media published a story about the Proud Boys and their terrorist status. And here is what the article had to say. Let me read to you from this article now. And by the way, this man here is quite relevant to all of this. His name is Ben King. He is the Chief Executive and the National Security Board Chair, and he's the guy who's advising the Prime Minister, and he's the guy who has the final oversight after the committee meets to discuss this question. And initially it looked like they were going to make the Proud Boys again a terrorist organisation, and then he advised the Prime Minister, no, in actual fact, I don't think they should be a terrorist organisation. They don't meet the criteria. Here's what he said. Here's what the article says. That's because designating any entity as a terrorist entity is a significant step, and it's important we maintain the integrity of the system. Amen. This is a return to important, prudent, and moral governance. This is really, really key what's going on here. You don't just use entities for political purposes. They must be governed by sound principle and truth, and that's what he's doing here. My review of the case for the Proud Boys, however, left me with questions about whether the evidence was sufficient to meet the test. He goes on to say this. King's letter continues to outline his U-turn rationale. I was not convinced on a final read that the statement of case met the test required by the Act, so the Terrorism Suppression Act in New Zealand. I want to be clear that Proud Boys is a distasteful, disruptive and corrosive organisation, but that its tactics and methods are well beyond the pale, but I think we require further work and reflection on the evidence base, which will feed into advice for the Prime Minister's consideration. I have recommended to the Prime Minister that he should not proceed with redesignating the Proud Boys as a terrorist entity. And then he goes on to say this, talking about the base. I reread the statement of case attached to the recommendation to the Prime Minister and considered the case remained strong for the base, but less so for the American Proud Boys. So this is a really, really important moment, and it sort of quietly passed by. New Zealand media, like Stuff, did a big piece about this, and what Stuff was trying to do here was effectively, this is very politicised, I feel, anyway, in my opinion, the reporting. They were presenting this as if somehow this was a lapse in judgment and a failure of government, to keep us all safe. And the underlying assumption here, if you read between the lines, is effectively this was something questionable. And in fact, the Proud Boys should still be designated as a terrorist entity. But like I said, and as you can see here, when you look at the response from Ben King and all of this, he's also quite clear that they don't meet the standard. So I was right in what I said 3 years ago. Now, I don't want to fall prey to podcasters' pride, which is where you then try and take some credit for this. Well, they listen to me, obviously. No, I don't for a second think that happened. And that's a real trap for a lot of podcasters. They think, I said something in public, I got a bit of traction. Yeah, it must be because of me that, the world's a better place. But it sort of proves exactly what I was saying 3 years ago. They should not have been designated a terrorist entity. And this is really, really important. So he's come to the same conclusion that I did by just looking at the facts of the case. The base, definitely terrorist group, right to designate them as such. The Proud Boys, we might find them repugnant and repulsive, but they are not. That's not what makes you a terrorist entity. Just because you are repulsed by them and you find their tactics to be like corrosive and disruptive. Because here's the thing. If you're going to do this with groups like the Proud Boys, then it's a very short step to be saying, well, let's do the same now with pro-life organisations or Christian groups in our country who have views that we find distasteful as liberals who have our own religious view of the world, which we often try and pretend is not really religious, but it always is. And so let's designate them as terrorist groups as well. And so it's really, really important. This is a really big moment. And I think what's been missed here by Stuff and their reporting and coverage of this is that, A, this is good because this means that the politicisation of our official institutions, in this case anyway, has come to an end. So what's happened here is there's been a return to a principles-based and truth-based approach to the question of how those institutions operate and come to the decisions that they make. That's a really good win for New Zealand. That's a really, really, really positive development. I can't understate, or I can't state enough. I could understate, but I can't state enough how important this is, how much of a U-turn this is, and it's a positive thing for our country. And of course, secondly, what's gone on here, I think, is there's been a careful discernment process, and it's good to see this. They're actually applying these principles well. They're looking at the case. They're not just adopting what has gone before. And I think this is really, really key. And the media should actually be happy about this because what it means is that there isn't a weaponization of our institutions. And that's good for everybody, including them, because they don't want to find themselves one day on the end of a ruling like this, where a different kind of government decides to turn on the media and say, well, let's designate particular journalists as terrorists engaged in terrorist activity because they dare to publicly question. They keep asking really hard questions and they're not, publishing and writing stories that we want in the way that we want. Now, I don't think it's unreasonable to imagine that a overzealous and overly tyrannical regime could do that if they wanted to. That's happened. We've seen that in human history before. So it's good for everybody that it's done this way and it's done with prudence. This is a really, really good outcome. I think what the challenge is now is for the mainstream media here is to ask, instead of sort of saying, and this is one thing that's really obviously missing from this. So if you go back and listen to my original podcast, and I'll post a link today somewhere in the episode notes so you can actually do that if you want to. In my original podcast, I went and did my due diligence. I looked at the facts on the ground. I looked at this group. I tried to understand them more. And that's how I came to my conclusion that they didn't meet the criteria. But it was clear to me that back then, when the media reported on this, and also today when they've reported about the U-turn, the media still hasn't done this. They haven't done what is basic due diligence here. They didn't go back and do what they should have done, which is say, let's look at the facts on the ground. Let's strip all of the politics and all of the, not so much the personality politics, but the politics of preference, I guess you describe it as, do I find it distasteful or not? That's not the issue here. It's not, do you find the Proud Boys to be lovely and nice and acceptable in your social circles? That's not the question. It seems that was how they approached this. Instead, what you've got to do is you've got to ask, well, what is the truth here? What are the principles that should apply? Do they legitimately actually meet the criteria to be a terrorist entity or not? And that's still missing here because the way this article is crafted from Stuff, the implication is that somehow this was a bit of a suspicious maneuver. Maybe there's some dodgy underhanded dealings gone on here. They go on to talk about how the Prime Minister received media, like a media packet with talking points about how he should explain this, as if somehow that's unusual. Like any journalist would know that is not unusual. That is normal. That's how media works. And you don't have a good comms team, a good media team, if they are not doing exactly this for you. This is exactly how Ardern ran her regime. She had a comm staff who provided her the talking points. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. That's how politics works. It works like that all over the place, and not just in politics, but all sorts of organisations who have comms staff in one way or another. That's exactly how this works. It's very normal. It's not unusual. But the way it's presented in this article as if, somehow there's some nefarious business and they needed some PR cover for this. No, it's just very normal stuff. They made a decision. Here's how the government and the Prime Minister in particular needs to talk about it and explain it to the New Zealand people so they can actually understand. And the right decision was made. This is really good. This is a great outcome. And it's not just a great outcome because, hey, I was right 3 years ago when I said this. It's a really great outcome for all of us who live in New Zealand and for common sense and a return to moral governance. Now, we've got a wee way to go yet, but this is a really positive development and we should definitely celebrate this. And I say, well done, the national government, for actually ensuring that you have the right kind of people. It's a key lesson in how personnel is really about where and how the shaping of society can happen in a very powerful and important kind of way. It's not simply about policy, it's about personnel. And here is someone Ben King, who's the right kind of man, who's got the wisdom and the prudence to know, okay, we need to actually stop and do this according to principle and according to truth. And that's a really, really good thing. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on The Dispatches.